Well, of all the speakers today, I think with the exception of Dan and Dave Wineland, I think I am the only one who was a student of Norman Ramsey's. So I always consider myself the same generation grandchild of Robbie, right? Is that how we do this scientifically? So one of the things that Norman used to always tell us when we were students is that he would admonish us that if you're going to a conference, make sure you take your lantern slides, the 2x2 things. Make sure you take them with you on the plane, because otherwise you'll lose and you'll get there to the conference and you'll be embarrassed. That morphed into make sure you take your view graphs, right? So clearly we all take our computers, but not all of you here probably left your computer at the security gate in Washington, D.C. So you don't get any slides. The talk I was going to give on warm, dense matter and the inside of stars and how Dan Kleppner taught me to think big and stars in my eyes are being looked at surreptitiously by the TSA guards. Can you imagine? Okay, so I'm going to replace the talk with I'm going to help Vander lay out here, and we're going to do this really quickly. It's just a series of little vignettes that I know almost by heart. I don't really need a cheat sheet because I have actually used these over and over and over to my students. So much, they have such a big impact on me, and it's quite serious. So Norman was a big believer in that you could explain anything to anybody if you just would calm down. And those of you who knew him, it was his famous spins, right? He'd always have two fingers. And Dan's version of that was not quite so benign. Dan's version early on was a very, I will use this word, baleful. He has a baleful stare. Anybody ever had that? He has a baleful stare. When he's not really pleased or he doesn't really understand something, he kind of, I can't really do it. He's doing it right now. Okay, so that look would always mean, why is that? And how do you know that? So this was a very early lesson in my life. I came down to be a postdoc right after I left Harvard. I came to MIT, and I shared the distinction of being with Ted Dukas, of being Dan's first postdocs. And we were there together, and it was the same time that Bill Phillips was there, and Bill and I were there when we had the Great Trek, where we went from Building 13 to Building 26. And I always thought that that was the first generation of Dan's students. And I remember, it was seared in my memory, he asked me to give a talk about my thesis to the group after I'd been there for a couple of days, a couple of weeks. So I get up and I give this talk, and I thought it was just fantastic. Of course I thought it was fantastic. And I got done to a point, and I made some pronouncement that I had proved something, or I prefer you can get the details, but I do remember this. I remember Dan, everybody, and Dan looked at me and he said, "How do you know that?" "How do I know what?" No, how do you know that? And it was pointing to something on the slide. And it was one of the things that I came to understand as something that he really believed in, which is if you're going to give a talk and you're going to have a slide, and you're going to have anything on a slide, if you have something on that slide, you better be able to talk about it, because in the audience, people are going to look at this and say, "What's that?" And it's something I've passed on to my students many times, and I'm sure most of you have who had students. You get somebody who comes, a new person comes up, and they got all kinds of stuff in their slide, and you go, what's that over there? And they go, gee, I haven't really thought about that. So that was a very important thing that we learned, and I have taken that idea of asking very pointed questions of my students when they've come up, very pointed in practice talks. I always tell them, if you think this is difficult, my giving you a bad time here in private, just wait until you're in front of a big audience. My students don't particularly like this. They call me somewhat of a terrorist on that subject, but I take it very seriously, and Dan is sitting here wondering why it is that I remember him in this vein. But he was a difficult person early on, and yes. I'm sure your later students think of you as a warm, fuzzy ball. Okay, so I want to tell a little story about his art of communication and how this has stayed with me, and I've talked to, in fact, Bill and I, when we were working on the magazine that you're going to get, we shared many discussions of this and found that we had very similar memories. This memory is one that just shows how much Dan believed in and does believe in science communication. So the first major paper I wrote with him, we were, as you saw from Serge Haroche's talk, we were very interested in the question of how alkali atoms could be fake hydrogen, and if we had to have alkali atom and we couldn't have hydrogen, we needed to understand how the lower angular momentum states were lower energy than the higher angular momentum states. And we had talked about that at great length, and so we got to wondering whether we could calculate those so-called quantum defects, which was the decrease in energy, if we could just calculate that in a fairly simple way. And so Dan, in his usual creative way, had this way of doing this with the wave functions, and what he wanted me to do was to take the wave function, and he wanted me to integrate the wave function through a Thomas Fermi model of the core and do all of this, relate it to everything else. And so off I went, and we did all of that, and we came back and we wrote the paper and put it all together. And when I finished, I went to him and I said, okay, here it is, but Dan, we can't publish it. And of course, baleful look, okay, insert baleful look. And he said, why not? And I said, because there's nothing new. It's all been done. I found, and I listed all these papers from, after all, none of what I just described to you is anything new. And it was all in the literature. It was all in various parts all over the place. And he said to me, how long did it take you to do this paper, Rick? And I said, well, I've been working on it all fall, I guess, 3-4 months. And he said, just exactly the point. Now you have a paper that completely explains it. People will read it, people will use it. It's called communication, and it's very important. And we published it, and it has, 300 or 400 citations, 35 years later. But it was a point I took very seriously, and I say this to my students all the time, that if you do science, and it's paraphrasing Dan, if you do science and you don't tell anybody about it, then it's useless. So doing and communicating were everything, and made a big difference in my career and how I've dealt with students. Well, that does take me to something that I think everyone who has ever worked with Dan, I think, can relate to, and that is, how many people have tried to publish, write a paper with Dan? Okay. You know what I'm going to say. Okay, I wrote my first papers, the majority of my first papers, I wrote them in years when, for all you young people, you know where the term cut and paste comes from in Microsoft Word? It comes from the fact that before we had word processors, you wrote everything out by hand, and then when you edited it, you would take your scissors and cut it, take out the part you wanted to keep, take it and paste it onto a piece of paper. And so you'd have all these paste things. Or if you had someone to type it, then when you got the typing back and you wanted to change it, you would keep the parts that you wanted to keep, you'd cut and you'd paste. So that is what we did. And so let me describe an absolutely accurate description of writing a paper with Dan. So he says, Rick, he says, that's okay, good work here in the lab, go write it up, first draft. So you go off, longhand, so like 6, 7, 8 pages, maybe 9 pages, longhand. Hand it in to him, it would take me, it's many weeks. Wasn't that fast a writer. Hand it in to Dan, and within an afternoon, it would come back. Red ink everywhere. I'm talking red ink everywhere. He'd say, here, I edited it. And of course it would be, things like this and stet, and I had to learn all the things because many of you don't know, at one time I think he came seriously close to being an English Don, it was at Cambridge, right? And so, he would have all these editing marks and he would send me back. And so, again, because it was cut and paste, because there was so much red ink, you'd write it all out longhand again. I'm talking days. You would come back, Bill, right? You would come back, you would give it to him. 2 hours later, red ink everywhere. It was like you hadn't even done it. And so, not to carry on too long, typically this would go on 3 times, sometimes 4. How did it converge? Because it did converge. It converged when you were able to show him that his red ink was on the things that he had already changed. At that point, he would say, yeah, okay. That was very typical. I learned to keep my changes. In fact, in the last move where I left California and went to Ohio, I actually threw out a bunch of stuff, my graduate student days, my postdoc days, and I actually had several of those, red ink things, because you needed them to prove to him that he was changing his own things. Right? Well, the truth is, of course, I'm making fun of it, but writing precisely, writing well, right to the point, logical flow from paragraph to making your point, not being extraneous, is something that was really drilled into me in that wonderful 3 years I had with him, and I have continued that way, and I am a bear with my own students because I can't stand bad English, number one, and I can't stand manuscripts that kind of wander off. You lost the point. My greatest expression of dislike is when I get down to the middle of a paragraph, one of my students, I'll write, "What is the point?" You've lost me, right? Okay. Anyway, I learned all of that from Dan. So finally, Dan did have a few pet peeves in writing, a couple of them. One of them was an easy one. I think you've heard other people, but he said this to us, and that was that every person, when they're born, should get exactly 5 exclamation points, and when they've used them, they're done. 5 in life. Okay? But that isn't as bad as his one favorite word that he absolutely hated. Absolutely hated. That word is very. As in, the effect was very strong, or the vacuum was very good, or whatever. Very, used as any adjective. He absolutely would strike every single very that was in your manuscript, period. Didn't matter. And his quote to me, which I use today, to my students is, I had to write it down, "Your use of very," this is a quote he said to me, and it was said with his baleful look. He wasn't being nice, by the way. He was being very serious. "Your use of very as essentially nothing to the information you wish to communicate, but loudly tells the reader that you are a sloppy, lazy writer." In editing this, since I got to spend hours and hours and hours on in front of the computer, there are lots Okay, finally, the last thing I want to say is that Dan not only didn't restrict his advice to us just on things having to do with physics, he oftentimes would offer us advice about how to live life. And this is one that I have, again, used many times and in many kind of after-dinner talks. And I always say, you know Dan Kleppner, so here's the story. So when I was a postdoc, he and B went to France for the summer. It was 6 months or something. You just picked up and left. He said, go forth and multiply. I'm going to Europe. And I said, well, what are you going to do when you're there? Where are you going to stay? He said, oh, well, I'm not too concerned. We have some very close friends who have a yacht. We are going to sail on this yacht in the Mediterranean for the summer. I remember exactly where we were. We were in Building 13, and we were walking over to the main hall. We were on the steps. I remember stopping, and I said, a yacht? Because to me, Dan was the quintessential New England, sort of very careful with his money, sort of didn't have excess money. And a yacht? You have friends who have a yacht. And I said, really? You're going to go on a yacht? And he said, yes. And I said, gee, how can you afford that? This is his quote, as best I can remember it. It was just, actually, it steered my memory. He turned to me and he said, well, Rick, if you can't be wealthy in life, choose your friends with care. Thank you for a wonderful time.
Yes, sir. Comments, right?
I'll just add a word of consolation, since I too have left a laptop at security, and I know the feeling, and you have my sympathy.
So I'd just like to add a very short comment. I absolutely agree with Dan on the issue of vary, and like Dan, I often fail to take my own advice. But one of the things I like to pass along to my students, and I'll pass it along to all of you, is something that Mark Twain said, probably the greatest American writer, said that whenever you are tempted to use the word vary, substitute damn instead. The editor will remove it, and the writing will be as it should.
Okay, we thank you, Professor Freeman.